Let's return to our top story now. And world leaders meeting here in Germany have promised to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed a summit of the G7 group of advanced economies in Bavaria. Speaking by video link, he called for tougher sanctions against Russia and renewed his plea for more advanced weapons to fight the war. The G7 nations are stressing their message of unity in the face of Russian aggression. I'm joined now by DW political correspondent Simon Young. Simon, we are expecting German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to speak any minute now. What are we expecting him to say?
Well, I think he'll be focusing in on the key things that have been happening today. The conversation that the G7 leaders had with President Zelensky of Ukraine. He was beamed in by video link, and as we've heard, the outlines of what he said, a demand for more weapons, but also showing how grateful Ukraine is for the support that G7 nations and others have given. The other thing, I think, is the involvement at this summit of other nations from the so-called Global South, India, Indonesia, Senegal, Argentina, other important nations that from the emerging world, if you like, emerging economies that are also affected, of course, by what's going on in Ukraine, but also by other global issues like the COVID pandemic and so on. So those leaders have been there as well today, and I hope and expect that we'll hear something about that from the Chancellor.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that in a minute because it's a really interesting part of it. But first, tell us a little bit more about the session that they had with Volodymyr Zelensky. Yeah,
well, I mean, as I say, we've only got outlines of what that conversation contained, but it seems that the G7 leaders told him that the West, G7 at least, which sort of stands, if you like, as for Western leadership, would continue to support Kiev, the Kiev government, as long as it takes, they said. And also importantly, they restated this message that it's up to Ukraine to decide when there might be the possibility of moving towards some sort of negotiated settlement with Russia. So, in other words, cutting off any idea that the West should sort of dictate terms or seek to set the framework of any future peace. No, that's for Ukraine, they said.
That's something that Italy, Germany and France had also said when they visited Ukraine, all the three leaders.
That's right. Anyway. It's not new, but it's, of course, important to reiterate it because as things come to a head, particularly at the moment, as we're seeing Russian advances, slow but steady, in the east of Ukraine, the voices grow here and there, including among politicians in this country, for, some thoughts to turn, anyway, to what might be a future settlement. And, of course, the desire to see this war end is on everyone's lips. It's just that, by saying we're backing Ukraine, at the moment, we're backing a clear policy of driving Russian forces out of Ukrainian territory. And that is a bottom line that is very clear. I think as far as Olaf Scholz is concerned, he says, our approach is tough but cautious. And I think what he means by that is, joining in these endorsements of support for Ukraine and, for instance, the pledges of more and more, the incremental pledges, if you like, of weapons deliveries to Kiev. But at the same time, as Scholz stresses, not escalating or doing anything that might escalate this war into a wider conflict, because there continues to be, of course, concern about that. Russia, after all, is a nuclear power. But he also says that the G7 nations are all aligned on this point. So although they may not use those same words, tough but cautious, he says at least that's what they're doing. So I think we may well hear those kind of ideas and that language from Olaf Scholz as well.
Yeah, he's had a bit of an image problem when it comes to Ukraine. I think they have been supporting them, but obviously, he's had a lot of criticism from inside and out for not doing things fast enough, I suppose. So we'll have to see. Now, I wanted to get back to, of course, the lunchtime session with the leaders of the G7 partners and these so-called outreach countries, India, Argentina, Indonesia, South Africa and Senegal. You mentioned it briefly. How did that go?
Well, I think the important point there, of course, is for the G7 to not look isolated, not look like it's some kind of rich countries club, which has often been the accusation, but instead to show that it is listening to those countries. A country like Senegal, which currently holds the presidency of the African Union, so it's got influence more perhaps than it usually has within the African context, but also Argentina, which is leading the South American economic grouping at the moment, and Indonesia is hosting the G20 meeting coming up in November of this year. So these are countries that have influence, that are at the centre of things, if you like. Also, they're recognised as democracies, and that's an important point for the G7 to make as well. So what was the meeting? Well, it was about the wider concerns. I think in particular food prices. You're hearing a lot of people saying, well, you've got your war in Europe, but we are suffering here because food prices are going up. Now, we've heard grumblings, for instance, from Sali Mak, the Senegalese leader, who's sort of saying, well, it's partly down to your sanctions against Russia that are actually causing that problem. Now, it may be that, to an extent, he's following a Russian narrative there, because that is something that the Kremlin has been pushing, the idea that, sanctions are the problem. But, of course, that's not quite right. Food is exempt from Western sanctions. But at the same time, it is also true that Western sanctions have driven up the oil price. But then again, you could say the oil price has gone up because of the war. So, of course, these issues are all complicated, they're interconnected, and I suppose what I would speculate is that at this meeting, the American president, the German Chancellor, and these other G7 leaders were hoping to sort of win some support for their view of things, that, they're on the right side of history on this matter, and they're just taking actions that they hope will lead to an end of the war and a just end, as they see it.
It's interesting what you say about Senegal, because, all 5 of these countries are likely to be quite affected by this food, called the cost of living crisis, if you want, what do you want to call it. Do you think that could likely bring them around, maybe to a more pro-Ukrainian stance?
Well, I don't know that they don't have a pro-Ukrainian stance, but of course they also have to. They see a different context. They've been to a greater or less extent trading partners with Russia in the past, and to the extent that they're oil importers, they they see the problem with the oil price. I think Senegal, interestingly, is looking at developing its own energy reserves, fossil fuel reserves, and that's something where they might, again, get support from European countries for doing that. I think there's a debate going on, and are we seeing Olaf Scholz emerging now as well?
He is. He's taking to the podium. He's standing here. We'll go to that live. It does look like he's going to speak shortly. He's taking to the podium, so we will go straight there. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz speaking at the G7 summit in Bavaria. Okay. Actually, I think he might be delayed. We were actually warned that the statement would be delayed today due to weather, so perhaps the proceedings are a little delayed in general. Olaf Scholz going to make a statement in the next few moments, but until then, Simon, we were talking about the 5 countries, the so-called outreach countries that were having a session at the G7. Now, 2 of those countries, Argentina and Indonesia, voted at the UN to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the other 3 abstained. Did G7 leaders use this as an opportunity to try and get more backings for sanctions against Russia?
Well, I think that, as I was saying, I think that's broadly what their message is. They need backing. They need to be able to say that it's not just the G7, it's backed in the global south as well. And as you said, a lot of these countries are under strain. We saw, I think, Olaf Scholz talking to the Argentinian leader just there. Argentina, too, is a country that has fossil fuel reserves, shale gas reserves that they'd like to export. So, each country looking for its own interests, undoubtedly, in this context. But you've got to see, particularly in Africa, the food issue is paramount. I think a lot of North African countries, particularly, they import a lot of grain from Ukraine and Russia normally, and of course a lot of that's not getting through. That could lead to a hunger crisis. I think it is leading to a hunger crisis already, and that of course can relatively quickly escalate into civil unrest. Problems like that, those are the sort of problems that certainly Europe doesn't want to see on its doorstep. And so it's necessary to sort of have the plans in place. How are we going to soften these effects? Because, as we know, they are coming down the track. Despite all the efforts that Western countries can make, for instance, to rearrange energy markets, that's something that takes a long time to do. Until then, prices are likely to be pushed higher, and that means pain for pretty well everybody, both rich and poor countries.
I just wanted to clarify for the audience, those pictures that we were seeing were in fact a replay of a bilateral meeting between Chancellor Scholz and the Argentinian leader Alberto Fernandez. We're still waiting for, we can see the pictures of the podium there, still no one there at it, so we'll wait a little bit longer. But of course, another key issue at the G7, Simon, is of course climate change and the energy transition. Now, how much of that topic has been affected by energy supply challenges? We were just talking about it, posted by the invasion and, of course, by those sanctions.
Well, I think it's concentrating minds, to an extraordinary extent. The German government says that it is still on track, and that indeed the G7, speaking as president of the G7, that all countries are broadly still on track to meet their climate goals, despite these policy adjustments that we're seeing. And of course, here in Germany, we've seen the economy minister saying, well, we'll probably have to have our coal-fired power stations running again, which a green minister announcing that. Of course, embarrassing, I suppose you would say. Certainly ironic for an environmentalist to be supporting that. They fought for decades to get those see the end of coal, and that has been decided. I should point out, there's no rowing back from the ultimate direction of travel, as they say, but a pragmatism has forced a rethink. That means coal will be running for a bit longer, but a lot of people are saying that's not going to be enough. You might have to have nuclear power stations running for a bit longer as well. They were due to be finally closed in Germany at the end of this year. So, there's the kind of rethink that's happening. But nonetheless, as I say, the German government says, well, we're still going to meet our targets. And Olaf Scholz had a key objective at this policy. And again, when we do hear his statement, I hope we'll hear whether or not he's been able to move that forward, namely to found a so-called climate club of nations that are committing to climate emissions neutrality by 2050. And he says, he really wants to get some momentum on the climate agenda out of this meeting. Again, it's good that those countries from outside Europe, outside the Western group, are there, because they can, of course, speak for that in their own context. No
easy situation with these conflicting, conflicting issues, really, like the energy problem and also climate change. It's kind of... So stay with us. We're still waiting for German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but while we're waiting for the Chancellor to address the media, my colleague Julia Sardelli spoke with